Alan Jackson moved through the bustling terminal of O'Hare International Airport. Just another traveler in a sea of weary faces. His worn jeans and a faded blue sweater, chosen more for comfort than appearance, allowed him to blend seamlessly with the early morning crowd. The only item that might hint at his success was the well-used leather laptop bag slung over his shoulder. It bore no logos, no monograms, just the quiet scuffs of years of practical use. To an outsider, Alan's unassuming demeanor might seem at odds with his reality. At 53, he was the CEO of Skyline Airways, a role that placed him among the most influential figures in the aviation industry. Yet, here he was, standing in line for a cup of coffee like everyone else. With no fanfare, no entourage, he had long ago decided that the trappings of power were less important than understanding the people he served. Every few weeks, he booked a flight under his own name, choosing to travel as an ordinary passenger. This, he believed, was the only way to truly see his airline through the eyes of those who relied on it. "Coffee, black," he said to the barista, his voice calm, almost soft, as he handed over a few crumpled bills. She didn't glance twice at him, though her paycheck, like thousands of others, came from his company. Alan liked it that way. Anonymity afforded him a clearer view of the world around him. He found a seat near his gate and opened his laptop. But his eyes didn't linger on the screen. Instead, they wandered, observing the quiet rhythms of airport life. A young mother juggled a crying toddler and a stroller, her face a mix of frustration and fatigue. A businessman argued on his phone, his gestures sharp and impatient. Two gate agents worked steadily through a queue of standby passengers, their voices calm despite the mounting tension in the line. Alan's gaze softened as he noticed one of the agents, a younger man with a bright, genuine smile, step out from behind the desk to assist an elderly passenger. She was struggling with her boarding pass, her hands trembling as she tried to fit it into the scanner. The agent took her hand gently, guiding her through the process with a patience that spoke volumes. Alan made a mental note to recognize the employee later. Moments like these were why he took these flights. Not just to observe problems but to catch glimpses of quiet humanity. His phone buzzed. A notification from Skyline's app informed him of an automatic upgrade to first class. Alan frowned. He usually declined such perks, preferring to remain in economy for the full experience. But the system had moved faster than he could this time. He sighed, resigning himself to the change. First class wasn't entirely foreign to him. But these flights weren't about comfort. They were about perspective. As he boarded the plane, Alan paused on the jet bridge, glancing through the small window at the crew loading luggage below. Their fluorescent vests stood out against the dull gray of the tarmac. He could still recall his first job in one of those vests, loading bags into freezing cargo holds during Chicago's brutal winters. It was a memory that kept him grounded, a reminder of the effort and precision that went unnoticed by most passengers. When Alan entered the first-class cabin, the flight attendant greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her gaze flickered briefly to his casual clothes before moving past him, focusing instead on a man in a tailored suit behind him. Alan felt the faintest pang of recognition, a subtle shift in demeanor, the kind he had witnessed countless times before. She wasn't overtly unkind, but there was an edge to her politeness, a reserved warmth that she seemed to ration for those she deemed more deserving. He settled into his seat by the window, his movements unhurried. Around him, the cabin buzzed with the quiet rituals of pre-flight preparations, overhead bins clicking shut, passengers exchanging small talk, the muted hum of engines as the plane prepared for departure. Alan sipped his coffee, now lukewarm, and observed. The young man seated across the aisle caught his attention, dressed in sneakers and a hoodie bearing the logo of a tech startup. He looked out of place among the polished suits and designer handbags. The flight attendant's expression tightened slightly as she approached him. Her tone clipped when he asked for water. Alan watched as the man shrank into his seat, earbuds in, head bowed. The interaction was over in seconds, but its weight lingered. These were the moments Alan had come to expect, though they never failed to trouble him. Bias was rarely loud or overt. It was quiet, almost invisible, woven into the fabric of everyday interactions. It was in the way someone's smile faltered or their voice stiffened. It was in who received extra napkins with their drink and who didn't. Alan opened his notebook and began to write. Not about the policies or quarterly goals that filled his office life, but about what he saw. What he felt. These notes had led to some of Skyline's most meaningful changes over the years: simpler boarding procedures, improved economy seating, better training for the crew. But as he jotted down his observations, Alan wondered if even his best efforts could address something so deeply ingrained. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their departure. Alan set his notebook aside and looked out the window as the plane taxied to the runway. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, and for a moment, the world outside felt still, almost serene. Inside the cabin, the quiet hum of routine continued, but Alan knew that beneath the surface, in the subtle glances and unspoken judgments, there was work to be done, and he was determined to do it. Alan Jackson leaned back in his seat as the familiar rhythms of boarding continued around him. Passengers shuffled past in uneven waves, juggling carry-ons and smartphones, their expressions ranging from mildly harried to quietly resigned. In the aisle beside him, a businessman settled into the seat with an air of ownership, his crisp suit brushing against the armrest as he tapped briskly on his phone. Across the cabin, an older couple whispered to one another, their voices low but animated as they unfolded a map. The cabin had the hushed tone of first class, a space where expectations lived quietly, yet palpably. In every interaction, Alan had spent decades in this industry, but this part of the plane still felt oddly foreign to him. Not because of the comfort or the perks. Those were easy enough to adjust to, but because of the invisible rules that governed behavior here. The flight attendant, her name tag reading Emily, moved through the aisle with practiced ease, her expression composed but faintly strained. She offered warm smiles and crisp pleasantries to those she deemed worth her attention. To others, those whose clothes or demeanor didn't align with her image of first class, her tone was cooler, her gestures brisk. It wasn't overt, but it was unmistakable, like a breeze shifting direction. Alan observed her carefully, his notebook discreetly open on his lap. She stopped at the seat across the aisle, where a young man in a hoodie and scuffed sneakers was adjusting his tray table. "Would you like a drink before takeoff?" Emily asked, her voice polite but distant. Water would be great," the man replied, offering a small smile. Emily's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "We'll begin beverage service after we reach cruising altitude," she said, stepping away before he could respond. Alan's gaze followed her as she moved on, her demeanor softening as she approached the businessman beside him. "Good morning, sir," she said warmly. "Can I offer you anything before we depart?" "A Bloody Mary," the man replied, without looking up from his phone. "Extra spicy." "Of course," Emily replied, her smile widening as she hurried toward the galley. Alan tapped his pen thoughtfully against the page. He had seen this pattern before countless times. In fact, it wasn't unique to Emily, nor even to Airlines. It was a quiet, persistent undercurrent that threaded through countless spaces in daily life, shaping interactions in ways that were subtle yet significant. Bias rarely shouted, it whispered. It lived in the slight edge to a voice, the fraction of a second delay in a smile, the unspoken judgments that hung in the air. And here, in the enclosed bubble of first class, it was particularly easy to notice. Emily returned moments later with the businessman's drink, setting it down with a flourish and offering a dish of warmed nuts. Alan caught her eye briefly as she passed but said nothing. He had long learned that confrontation, particularly in these moments, rarely led to understanding. Observation was his tool of choice, a quiet, deliberate gathering of details, each one forming part of a larger picture. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and Emily began preparing for the official beverage service. When she passed the young man in the hoodie again, he tried once more to catch her attention. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly, "could I get that water now?" Her response was measured, but her expression betrayed a flicker of annoyance. "As I mentioned earlier, we'll begin beverage service shortly." This time, she didn't stop walking. Alan felt a faint tightening in his chest, a pang of familiarity with the young man's position. He, too, had been dismissed like this once. Years ago, when he first began to rise through the ranks of the airline. Back then, it had stung deeply, though he had hidden it well. The world had moved on, unaware of the small wound it had left behind. Now, sitting quietly in his seat, Alan considered the countless small wounds that likely went unnoticed every day. They weren't dramatic, not the kind of events that made headlines or sparked outrage, but they accumulated, shaping how people felt about themselves, how they moved through the world. The businessman beside him pressed his call button, summoning Emily once again. She appeared almost instantly, her smile bright, her tone eager. "Yes, sir?" she asked. "Another Bloody Mary. And this time, make it stronger," he said with a chuckle. Emily nodded, her movements swift and efficient. When she returned, the drink was accompanied by another dish of nuts and an extra napkin, folded neatly on the tray. Alan made another note in his book. The contrast was undeniable, even if it would be invisible to most. And that was precisely the problem. As the plane ascended, Alan gazed out the window at the receding cityscape below. He thought about the training programs he had implemented, the policies designed to ensure equity and respect across every level of service. But policies could only do so much. Changing a culture, changing minds required more than memos and workshops. It required a reckoning with the quiet, ingrained behaviors that no one wanted to admit were there. Emily walked past again, and Alan saw the moment her eyes flicked toward his attire, a brief assessment. A silent judgment. He wasn't offended, he was used to it. But it reminded him why he was here. Sitting in this seat, wearing these clothes. The cabin grew quieter as the plane reached cruising altitude. Alan glanced at the young man across the aisle, who had now pulled out a tablet, his head down. He didn't seem upset, but Alan knew better than to assume. Emily returned to begin the formal beverage service. Her interactions efficient and professional, but always tinged with that subtle variance. Alan observed her, not with anger, but with the quiet determination of someone who had spent his life unraveling these patterns, thread by thread. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the clouds, Alan closed his notebook and leaned back in his seat. There was still much to observe, much to understand, and, he thought with a quiet resolve, much to change. The plane cruised steadily at 35,000 feet. The hum of the engines blending into the low murmur of passengers. Alan Jackson set his coffee cup down gently on the tray table, his gaze moving across the cabin. Everything appeared calm on the surface. But he had learned long ago that calm could be deceiving. It was in the subtleties, the way people moved, spoke, and reacted, that the true dynamics of a space revealed themselves. Emily was making her rounds again, her polished smile firmly in place as she approached the businessman beside Alan. Her voice carried an easy warmth as she asked if he needed anything else. The man chuckled and gestured toward his empty glass. "Another Bloody Mary," he said, "and let's make it a double this time." "Of course," Emily replied, her tone almost flirtatious. She disappeared into the galley, returning moments later with the requested drink and a small dish of nuts, which she placed on the tray with practiced precision. Alan observed her, his expression neutral. There was no mistaking the contrast in her behavior. The businessman received not just service but attention, a level of care that Emily seemed unwilling, or unable to extend to certain others. He wondered if she even realized it herself. When she moved to the aisle seat across from him, her demeanor shifted. The young man in the hoodie looked up hesitantly, as if unsure whether to speak. "Excuse me," he began, his voice soft. "Could I get some water?" Emily's smile vanished, replaced by a thin, polite mask. She didn't stop walking. "As I mentioned earlier," she said, her tone clipped, "we'll begin beverage service shortly." The young man nodded, shrinking slightly into his seat as she passed. Alan's pen hovered over his notebook, capturing the moment in a few quick strokes. He had seen this play out many times before, different faces, different places, but always the same story. It wasn't the water request that mattered. It was the dismissal, the subtle message that the young man didn't belong. Alan closed his notebook and folded his hands in his lap, his fingers resting lightly on the worn leather cover. The real work, he knew, was in understanding why moments like this continued to happen. Policies and training could address the obvious issues, but they often fell short of the deeper, quieter biases that shaped so much of human interaction. As the flight continued, Alan watched Emily with a measured calm. She moved through the cabin efficiently, her every motion precise. Yet there was a tension to her movements, a rigidity that seemed to grow with each interaction. It wasn't just about service, it was about control. About maintaining a certain order that existed only in her mind. At one point, a pregnant woman from economy approached the first-class lavatory, her steps slow and deliberate. Emily intercepted her before she could reach the door. "I'm sorry," Emily said, her voice firm but not unkind. "This lavatory is reserved for first-class passengers. There are facilities available in the rear of the plane." The woman hesitated, her hand resting on her lower back. "I understand," she said, her tone apologetic, "but the lines back there are really long. And it's..." "Policy is policy," Emily interrupted, gesturing toward the back of the plane. "I'm sure the wait won't be too long." The woman nodded, her face flushed, and turned to make her way back. Alan's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. This, too, was part of the pattern. The rigid enforcement of rules, applied unevenly depending on who was asking. Alan made another note in his book. He didn't write about Emily specifically, it wasn't about her. It was about what she represented. The quiet, systemic biases that lingered even in places that prided themselves on progress. These moments weren't loud or overt, but they left marks nonetheless. As the flight attendant Chris passed through the cabin, Alan noticed the difference immediately. Chris moved with an easy grace, his smile genuine as he stopped to assist passengers. When he reached the young man in the hoodie, he didn't hesitate. "Hey there," Chris said warmly, handing over a bottle of water. "Hope this helps." "Thanks," the young man replied, his relief evident. Emily watched the interaction from a distance, her expression unreadable. Alan caught her gaze briefly, and for a moment, he thought he saw something shift in her eyes. An awareness, perhaps, or even discomfort, but the moment passed, and she turned away. The hours wore on, and the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Alan leaned back in his seat, his thoughts drifting. He thought about the many flights he had taken over the years, the countless interactions he had observed. The faces changed, but the patterns remained. It was easy to dismiss these moments as isolated incidents. But Alan knew better. They were part of a larger mosaic, one that told a story about who was valued and who wasn't. As the plane began its descent, Alan closed his notebook and slipped it into his bag. He would review his notes later. But for now, he focused on the cabin around him. The businessman beside him had fallen asleep, his empty glass teetering precariously on the edge of the tray table. The young man in the hoodie was staring out the window, earbuds in, lost in his own thoughts. Emily passed by once more, her movements brisk but contained. Alan watched her carefully, his expression calm but thoughtful. She wasn't a bad person, he could see that. But she was part of a system that allowed these biases to thrive. And in her own way, she upheld it. The plane touched down smoothly, the runway lights casting long shadows across the tarmac. As the passengers began to gather their belongings, Alan remained seated, his hands resting lightly on his lap. There would be more to observe, more to consider, and, eventually, there would be conversations to be had. For now, though, he watched as the cabin emptied, his mind quietly turning over the pieces of the story he had just witnessed. The cabin was settling into its usual mid-flight routine, the hum of the engines providing a steady backdrop to the muted clinks of cups and trays. Alan Jackson folded his hands neatly in his lap, observing as the flight attendants moved through the aisles. To most, the atmosphere seemed calm, just another flight gliding smoothly through the sky. But Alan, trained by years of quiet observation, could sense the undercurrents. Emily passed by with her tray, her steps precise and her demeanor tightly controlled. Alan noticed how she lingered at certain seats, her tone warm and accommodating, while others received only the bare minimum of courtesy. It wasn't overt, not something most passengers would notice or call out. But it was there, small acts of exclusion, tiny fractures in the veneer of professionalism. The young man in the hoodie, seated across the aisle, was one of those who fell into Emily's less favorable category. Alan watched as the man glanced hesitantly toward her, clearly trying to summon the courage to make another request. "Excuse me," the young man said finally, his voice polite but tentative. "Could I get another bottle of water?" Emily turned toward him, her smile mechanical, her eyes cool. "We're currently finishing up service in this cabin. I'll see what I can do later." She moved on without waiting for a reply, leaving the young man to shrink back into his seat. Alan's gaze flicked between the two of them, his expression unchanged but his thoughts turning. Moments like these spoke volumes. Not in words, but in the space between them. The businessman beside Alan stirred, setting his glass on the edge of the tray table and pressing the call button with an air of entitlement. Emily appeared almost immediately, her posture straight, her smile warmer now. "Yes, sir?" she asked. "Another Bloody Mary," he said, barely glancing up. "And this time, don't skimp on the vodka." "Of course," Emily replied, her voice taking on a light, almost playful tone. She returned swiftly, the glass perfectly prepared, accompanied by a dish of warm nuts and an extra napkin folded neatly on the tray. The businessman offered a curt nod, and Emily moved away, her expression softening as she stepped toward the galley. Alan remained silent, but his pen moved quietly across the page of his notebook. The stark contrast in service was impossible to ignore, yet he knew better than to address it directly in the moment. Confrontation rarely solved anything. It only entrenched defenses. No, change required understanding, and understanding took time. As Emily returned to the cabin, her tray in hand, her steps slowed near Alan's row. Her eyes flicked briefly to his casual sweater and jeans, a subtle glance that carried more weight than she likely intended. She reached for his nearly empty coffee cup without asking. "Would you like a refill?" she asked, her tone polite but flat. "No, thank you," Alan replied evenly, his voice calm. Her gaze lingered for a moment longer before she moved away. Alan noticed how she straightened her posture, her focus shifting to a passenger a few rows ahead who was dressed in a tailored suit. The small gestures. The slightly wider smile, the fractionally longer pause, spoke volumes about where her attention was invested. The cabin returned to its hum of quiet activity. Passengers shifted in their seats, some working on laptops, others thumbing through magazines. Alan turned his focus to the window, watching the endless stretch of clouds below. It was in these moments of stillness that he often found clarity, the space to piece together the patterns he had observed. Suddenly, a commotion broke the quiet. Alan turned his head just in time to see Emily standing by his row, her hand brushing against the businessman's tray table. The man had leaned back slightly, and in the process, his arm jostled his empty glass. Emily reached to catch it but missed, her hand instead knocking against Alan's own tray. The motion was quick, almost imperceptible, but the result was immediate. A stream of orange juice spilled across Alan's lap, the cold liquid soaking into his sweater and jeans. For a moment, there was silence, a collective intake of breath from those nearby. Emily froze, her hand still midair, her expression shifting from surprise to something harder to place. "Oh dear," she said, her voice carefully measured. "These things happen when passengers aren't careful with their trays." She reached for a single napkin, offering it to Alan as if the spill were his fault. There was no apology in her tone, no acknowledgement of her role in the mishap. Alan looked down at the stain spreading across his clothes. He reached for his own pack of tissues from his bag, dabbing at the fabric with slow, deliberate movements. Around him, passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity barely hidden. The young man across the aisle pulled out his phone, angling it subtly as if to record the scene. Emily remained standing, her composure cracking slightly under the weight of the silence. "If you'd like, I can bring you some club soda to help with the stain," she said, her voice faltering. Alan met her gaze for the first time, his expression calm but piercing. "That won't be necessary," he said quietly. "Accidents do happen, after all." Emily's posture stiffened, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might respond. But instead, she nodded curtly and stepped away. Her movements clipped as she returned to the galley. The tension in the cabin lingered, an unspoken discomfort that hung in the air like static. Alan set the tissues aside, his hands resting lightly on his lap. He felt the eyes of other passengers on him, their curiosity palpable, but he remained still, his gaze drifting once more to the window. Moments like this weren't new to him. They weren't even particularly surprising. But they always carried the same weight. A quiet reminder of the work that still needed to be done. As the plane continued its journey, Alan returned to his notebook. The ink flowing steadily across the page. The juice would dry, the stain would fade, but the memory of this moment would remain another thread in the fabric of a story that demanded to be told. The cabin had settled into an uneasy calm after the incident with the spilled juice. But the tension lingered, like a faint hum in the air. Passengers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting occasionally toward Alan Jackson. Some watched Emily's movements as she resumed her duties, her composure visibly frayed. Others glanced at the young man across the aisle, who now sat with his phone resting conspicuously in his lap. Alan, however, remained still. His damp sweater clung to him uncomfortably, the faint citrus scent of orange juice lingering as a reminder of the encounter. Yet his expression betrayed no annoyance, no frustration. He appeared, to the casual observer, entirely unaffected. But inside, Alan's thoughts were turning. He had encountered these moments before, moments when assumptions and biases collided with reality, forcing a reckoning. This one was no different, except that it had unfolded publicly, under the curious eyes of a cabin full of passengers. Emily approached again, her steps hesitant this time. She carried a small glass of club soda and a neatly folded napkin, holding them out as though they might serve as a peace offering. "For the stain," she said, her voice quieter than before. Alan accepted the items with a polite nod but didn't say a word. He dabbed at the juice-soaked fabric methodically, aware of the silence stretching between them. Emily lingered for a moment, as if waiting for some acknowledgement. But when none came, she moved away quickly, her shoulders tense. It wasn't long before she returned again, this time with a clipboard in hand. Her tone was firmer now, the professionalism in her voice masking something deeper, nervousness, perhaps, or an unspoken frustration. "Sir," she began, "I need to verify your boarding pass. We've had some mix-ups with seating today." Alan looked up, his gaze calm but direct. "Is there a problem?" "No problem," Emily replied, though her tone wavered slightly. "I just need to confirm that this is your assigned seat." Alan reached for his phone, pulling up the digital boarding pass without hesitation. He handed it to her, watching as her eyes scanned the screen. For a brief moment, her expression flickered, confusion, followed by something sharper. "This must be an error," she said, her tone insistent. "Upgrades are typically reserved for our frequent flyers or elite status members." Alan tilted his head slightly, studying her with a quiet intensity. "I'm aware of the policy," he said evenly. "Would you like to see my frequent flyer information as well?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "That won't be necessary," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. She stepped back, muttering something under her breath as she returned to the galley. Alan leaned back in his seat, his fingers resting lightly on the armrest. Around him, the cabin had grown quieter, passengers now fully attuned to the unfolding tension. The businessman beside him pretended to scroll through his phone, but his movements were distracted, his focus clearly elsewhere. The young man across the aisle had put his earbuds back in, but Alan could tell he was still paying attention. Minutes later, Emily returned, this time with the senior flight attendant, Sandra, at her side. Sandra's expression was professional but strained, as though she already understood the weight of the situation. "Mr. Jackson," Sandra began, her tone calm but formal, "we'd like to apologize for any inconvenience. Emily mentioned there was some confusion about your seat." "No confusion," Alan replied, his voice steady. "This is my seat." Sandra glanced at Emily, who seemed to shrink slightly under the scrutiny. "Of course," Sandra said quickly. "We'll make sure everything is resolved." Emily, however, wasn't ready to let it go. "It's just," she started, her voice tight. "Our premium cabin has certain standards. I mean, typically, our first-class passengers." Alan raised a hand gently, stopping her mid-sentence. Typically. What? He asked, his tone even but pointed. Emily faltered, her words catching in her throat. Typically, they present themselves differently. She finished, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of her words settling over the cabin like a thick fog. Alan sat back, his expression unchanged, but his voice carried a quiet authority as he spoke. And how, exactly, should a first-class passenger present themselves? Emily didn't respond. Her gaze darted toward Sandra, who looked away uncomfortably, then back to Alan. The color drained from her face as realization began to dawn. As if she were finally seeing him. Really seeing him. For the first time. Alan reached for his laptop, opening it with deliberate calm. He turned the screen toward her. The Skyline Airways logo prominently displayed at the top of the document. "I'm Alan Jackson," he said simply, CEO of Skyline Airways. The revelation landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward in the form of gasps and murmurs from nearby passengers. Emily's face turned pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the clipboard against her chest. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely audible. Alan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "That's the point," he said quietly. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Sandra stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Emily, why don't we step into the galley for a moment?" she suggested, placing a guiding hand on her colleague's arm. Emily nodded wordlessly, allowing herself to be led away. The cabin remained silent, every passenger acutely aware of what had just transpired. Alan returned to his seat, closing his laptop with a quiet click. The young man across the aisle caught his eye, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. Alan nodded back, a subtle exchange that spoke volumes without a single word. As the plane continued its journey, Alan leaned back in his seat, his thoughts heavy. The work ahead was clear. There would be conversations, decisions, changes, but for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet. The steady hum of the engines a backdrop to his reflections. This was more than a personal slight. It was a symptom of something deeper, something embedded in the fabric of society. And like all deeply rooted issues, it would take time, effort, and resolve to untangle. Alan was ready for the challenge. After all, it was why he had taken this flight in the first place. The cabin was unusually quiet as the plane continued its journey toward Seattle. Passengers sat in subdued silence, their earlier conversations now replaced by sidelong glances and hushed whispers. Alan Jackson remained in his seat, his posture composed, his expression calm, as if the confrontation moments earlier had barely registered. Yet, beneath his stillness, his thoughts churned. In the galley, Emily stood with her back against the counter, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. Her breath came shallow, and her mind raced. Sandra, the senior flight attendant, stood nearby, her tone low but firm as she spoke. "You've crossed a line, Emily," Sandra said gently, but with unmistakable authority. "This isn't just about one passenger or one mistake. You need to understand the weight of what's happened here." "I didn't mean," Emily began, her voice faltering. She stopped herself, her words feeling hollow even to her own ears. "It's not about what you meant," Sandra replied, her gaze steady. "It's about the choices you made, the assumptions you acted on." The words landed heavily, pressing on Emily in a way she hadn't anticipated. She looked away, unable to meet Sandra's eyes. Back in the cabin, Alan took a sip of water from a fresh glass, his earlier annoyance with the spilled juice forgotten. Around him, the passengers seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps an apology, a resolution, or just a sign that the situation was over. Alan, however, knew better. This wasn't the kind of incident that could be tidily resolved in the span of a flight. It was part of something larger, a pattern that couldn't be unraveled with a single conversation. Chris, the younger flight attendant, passed through the aisle with a tray of beverages. His movements were unhurried, his smile genuine as he attended to each passenger without distinction. When he reached Alan's row, he paused. "Anything else I can get for you, sir?" Chris asked, his tone warm. Alan shook his head. "No, thank you." You've been excellent. Chris nodded, a flicker of appreciation crossing his face before he moved on. Alan watched him for a moment, noting the stark contrast between Chris's quiet professionalism and Emily's fraught demeanor. It wasn't just about training or experience. It was about attitude. About a willingness to see every passenger as deserving of the same respect. The intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. Calm and measured. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Seattle. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, and your tray tables are in the upright position. Alan leaned back slightly, adjusting his seatbelt. The descent brought with it a shift in the atmosphere, a sense of anticipation. As though everyone was bracing for the next chapter of the journey. Whatever it might entail. In the galley, Sandra placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. A gesture both firm and reassuring. Take a breath, Sandra said softly. You'll have a chance to explain yourself. But right now, we need to focus on landing this plane. Emily nodded, her grip on the clipboard loosening. She stepped aside, letting Sandra take the lead. It was a small gesture, but it marked the beginning of something, a moment of recognition, however faint, that she had lost her way. As the plane touched down smoothly, the runway lights casting long streaks of gold across the windows, Alan felt a sense of quiet resolve settle over him. The events of this flight weren't isolated. They were a microcosm of the broader issues he had been grappling with for years. This was why he chose to fly incognito. To see these moments firsthand. To understand the gaps in his airline's culture that still needed to be bridged. As the plane taxied to the gate, Sandra emerged from the galley, her expression composed but serious. She stopped by Alan's seat, leaning in slightly to speak in a low voice. Mr. Jackson, she began, her tone respectful. I want to apologize on behalf of the crew. This isn't how we're trained to serve our passengers. And it certainly isn't the standard you've worked so hard to set. Alan met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. Thank you, Sandra, he said evenly. I appreciate your professionalism, but what matters most is what happens next. Sandra nodded, understanding the weight of his words. We'll address it. I'll make sure of it. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers began gathering their belongings, the hum of conversation resuming as they prepared to disembark. Alan stayed seated, watching the flow of movement around him. He caught the eye of the young man across the aisle, who offered him a small, tentative smile. Alan nodded in return, a silent acknowledgement of shared experience. In the galley, Emily stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her. She watched as Sandra guided the other crew members through their post-flight duties. Her own role diminished in the wake of her actions. For the first time in years, she felt unsure of her place. Not just on this flight, but within the larger framework of her work. As the last passengers filed out, Alan rose, slipping his notebook into his bag. He paused by the galley, where Sandra and Emily stood side by side. Emily looked up, her expression a mixture of apprehension and regret. Mr. Jackson, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I'm sorry. Alan regarded her quietly for a moment, his gaze steady but not unkind. I believe you, he said simply, but apologies are only the first step. What matters is what you do next. Emily nodded, her throat tightening as she struggled to find the right words. But Alan didn't wait for her to speak again. He turned to Sandra, offering her a faint smile. You have a good team here, he said. Don't let one moment define them, or her. Sandra nodded, her expression resolute. We won't. As Alan stepped off the plane, the cool Seattle air greeted him like a quiet reminder of the work that lay ahead. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just another chapter in an ongoing journey. One that demanded patience, perseverance, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. He adjusted the strap of his bag on his shoulder, his footsteps steady as he walked toward the terminal. The world outside was vast and complex, filled with countless stories like the one that had just unfolded. And though the work was far from finished, Alan knew he was ready to continue it. One flight, one conversation, one moment at a time. 2 weeks after the flight, Alan Jackson sat in the conference room of Skyline Airways' Chicago headquarters. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the bustling airport. planes taxiing and lifting off into the sky. For Alan, the view was a constant reminder of the company's purpose, moving people safely and efficiently. Yet, what had transpired on Flight 2716 reminded him of the silent human responsibilities behind that mission, responsibilities that required more than policies and operational excellence. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of his notebook. Across the table sat members of Skyline's leadership team, along with Sandra, the senior flight attendant from the Seattle flight, and a visibly nervous Emily. The meeting began with Sandra presenting her report. Her voice was steady as she recounted the events, sparing no detail but maintaining a professional tone. When she finished, the room was quiet, the weight of her account lingering in the air. Alan glanced at Emily, who sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her usually composed demeanor was gone, replaced by an unmistakable vulnerability. She seemed smaller now, her confidence eroded by the gravity of the situation. Emily, Alan said finally, his voice calm but firm. I've read the reports. I've heard Sandra's account. But I want to hear from you. What happened on that flight? Emily's throat tightened as she met his gaze. For a moment, she hesitated, but then she took a deep breath. I let my assumptions guide me, she admitted, her voice trembling. I thought I was protecting the first-class experience, upholding standards, but I see now that those standards were based on my own biases, not the company's values. Alan nodded, his expression unreadable. And what do you think that means for our passengers? For the people you serve? It means. Emily paused, her words faltering as she searched for the right answer. It means I failed them. I failed to treat every passenger with the respect they deserve, no matter who they are or what they look like. The room remained silent as Emily's words hung in the air. Alan could sense the sincerity in her voice, the beginnings of a realization that would hopefully lead to meaningful change. But sincerity alone wasn't enough. This isn't just about you, Emily, Alan said quietly. What happened on that flight is a reflection of a larger issue, a cultural blind spot within our company. It's not enough to train for technical excellence. We have to train for humanity, for empathy. He turned to the leadership team, his voice gaining strength. If we're serious about being a world-class airline, we need to confront these issues head-on. That means implementing new training programs, not just for flight attendants but for every employee who interacts with our passengers. We need to create a culture where respect is non-negotiable. Sandra nodded, her expression resolute. We've already started developing a program, she said. Chris, the other flight attendant from that day, has volunteered to help lead it. He's passionate about creating a more inclusive environment. Alan allowed a small smile. Chris is exactly the kind of person we need to elevate. Let's make sure he has the support he needs. He turned back to Emily, his tone softening. And you, Emily, you've made mistakes, but you've also shown that you're willing to learn. Are you ready to do the work required to rebuild trust? Not just with me, but with every passenger you serve? Emily swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, Mr. Jackson, I am. Alan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. This isn't about punishment, Emily. It's about growth. We're going to give you the resources to understand your biases, to unlearn the patterns that led to that moment on Flight 2716. But make no mistake, this will be hard work. Are you ready for that? Yes, Emily said again, her voice firmer this time. I won't let this define me. I'll prove that I can change. The meeting ended with clear directives. A comprehensive sensitivity training program would be developed, one that went beyond surface-level fixes to address the deeper issues at play. Emily would undergo the program herself, along with additional coaching, and serve as an example for others in the company. Weeks later, Alan sat in the back of a large training room at Skyline's main operations center. The room was filled with flight attendants, gate agents, and customer service representatives, all gathered for the first session of the new program. Emily stood at the front, her uniform crisp, her demeanor composed but humble. My name is Emily, she began, her voice steady. And 2 months ago, I made a mistake. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. And I treated passengers in a way that went against everything this company stands for. Today, I want to share what I've learned. Not because I have all the answers, but because I'm committed to being part of the solution. The room was silent as Emily recounted her story. She spoke candidly about her biases, her missteps, and the moment she realized how deeply she had failed. Her words were raw and unflinching. And as she spoke, Alan saw nods of recognition ripple through the crowd. She wasn't the only one who had made assumptions. She wasn't the only one who needed to change. When Emily finished, Alan rose from his seat and joined her at the front. What happened on Flight 2716 wasn't just about one person or one moment. He said, it was a wake-up call for all of us. This program isn't just about fixing mistakes. It's about creating a culture where every passenger feels valued and respected, no matter who they are. As the session continued, Alan watched the faces in the room. There was skepticism, yes, but also hope, a glimmer of possibility that change was not only necessary but achievable. And as Emily fielded questions, her voice growing stronger with each answer, Alan felt a quiet satisfaction. This was the work that mattered. This was how progress began. The session ended with quiet applause. The kind that signaled not celebration, but resolve. People lingered in small groups, talking about what they had heard, sharing their own experiences. Emily stood off to the side, her shoulders slightly hunched, but her expression calm. Alan approached her, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. Good work today, he said simply. Emily looked up at him, her eyes bright. Thank you, she replied. I'm just glad I got the chance to make it right. Alan nodded, his gaze sweeping over the room. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. One flight, one conversation, one moment at a time. 2 months after the events of Flight 2716, Alan Jackson boarded another Skyline Airways flight, this time from New York to Los Angeles. As always, he dressed casually, worn jeans, a simple sweater, and his trusty leather bag. He moved quietly through the terminal, unnoticed among the throngs of travelers. His anonymity intact. It was how he preferred it. The boarding process was efficient, the gate agents polite and attentive. Alan observed the interactions carefully, noting how they greeted each passenger with a uniform courtesy that felt sincere. There was no hesitation, no subtle differences in tone or demeanor. It was a small change, but an important one, a sign that the new training programs were beginning to take root. When he stepped onto the plane, Alan was greeted by a flight attendant whose name tag read Chris. The same Chris from Flight 2716. His warm smile was unchanged, but there was a new confidence in his posture, a quiet pride in his role. Good morning, sir, Chris said, gesturing toward the aisle. Welcome aboard. Let me know if there's anything you need. Alan nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. He settled into his seat, this time in economy, where he could better observe the day-to-day experience of the average passenger. Around him, families wrangled restless children, business travelers tapped on laptops, and retirees flipped through paperbacks. The familiar hum of pre-flight activity filled the cabin, but Alan's attention was on the crew. Chris moved easily through the aisles, offering assistance with the same genuine warmth he'd shown months ago. Another flight attendant, a young woman in her 20s, mirrored his demeanor, her tone friendly and consistent with each passenger. Alan noted how they worked together, creating an atmosphere that felt welcoming and unhurried. Halfway through the flight, Alan stood to stretch his legs. As he made his way toward the galley, he paused near the first-class cabin, where Emily was assisting a passenger with his seat adjustments. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her expression calm but engaged. There was no trace of the rigidity or judgment she had once displayed. Instead, her body language exuded a sense of purpose, her interactions marked by genuine care. She caught sight of Alan and hesitated, her eyes widening briefly before she nodded in acknowledgement. Alan returned the nod, his expression neutral but approving. He continued toward the back of the plane, observing as passengers relaxed into their journey. The galley was bustling with activity when Alan arrived. Chris was there, replenishing a tray of drinks, while the young flight attendant organized snacks. They greeted him warmly, offering water and a quiet spot to stand while they worked. Alan took a sip from the offered cup, listening as they discussed how best to assist a passenger with limited mobility. It's about anticipating needs before they become issues, Chris said, his tone thoughtful. You don't wait for someone to ask. You look for ways to help. The younger flight attendant nodded. That's what they talked about in training. Seeing every passenger as a priority. Not just the ones who are easiest to serve. Alan felt a flicker of satisfaction. The training sessions, led in part by Emily and Chris, had emphasized exactly that: proactive kindness, equal treatment, and an awareness of unconscious biases. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. And here, in this small moment, he saw it in action. Back in his seat, Alan opened his notebook, jotting down a few observations. He wrote about the passengers. The mother calming her fussy toddler. The elderly couple sharing a crossword puzzle. The young man in headphones lost in thought. He wrote about the crew. Their professionalism tempered with humanity. And he wrote about the changes he had witnessed. Small but significant, over the course of the flight. As the plane began its descent, Alan closed his notebook and gazed out the window. The sprawling expanse of Los Angeles came into view, its streets and buildings glinting in the late afternoon sun. The descent felt steady, purposeful, much like the company's journey toward a better culture. When the plane landed, Alan waited until most passengers had disembarked before gathering his things. As he stepped into the jet bridge, Chris caught up to him. Mr. Jackson, Chris said, his voice quiet but earnest. I just wanted to thank you for everything. I know the last few months haven't been easy, but it feels like we're moving in the right direction. Alan looked at him for a moment, then extended his hand. You've done the hard work, Chris. Keep leading by example. Chris nodded, his grip firm. We will. As Alan walked toward the terminal, he felt a sense of quiet resolve. The work was far from finished. There would always be challenges, setbacks, and moments of reflection. But the flight had shown him that change was possible. Not through grand gestures or sweeping proclamations, but through the small, steady acts of humanity that defined each journey. Out on the tarmac, another plane lifted into the sky, its wings catching the light as it climbed. Alan watched it disappear into the clouds, a quiet smile on his face. There was still so much to do, so many flights to take, so many stories to hear. But in this moment, he felt a rare sense of hope, a belief that, one flight at a time, the path forward was clear.